In 1976, two college dropouts sold a van and a calculator to raise $1,300. That's it. $1,300 and a garage that didn't even belong to them. It belonged to one of their parents. Today, the company they built from that $1,300 has been worth, at its peak, close to $4 trillion. Run the math, and that's a return of roughly 3 billion times the original investment. Not 3 billion%, 3 billion times. But here's what almost nobody puts in the title. That company came within weeks, not years, weeks, of running out of cash entirely. It got fired, sold, nearly merged out of existence, and was once publicly written off by one of its biggest rivals as a company that should just shut down and give the money back. This is the operational story of Apple. The gambles, the near-death experience, the management style that was genius in one room and catastrophic in the next, and the supply chain decision that quietly did more to make Apple a trillion-dollar company than any single product Steve Jobs ever unveiled on stage. And at the end, we'll get to something else nobody tells you. Apple isn't even the most valuable company in the world anymore. Stick around for that. Let's start by killing the myth, because the real story is better than the legend. April 1st, 1976. Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and a third man almost nobody remembers, Ronald Wayne, sign a 2-page partnership agreement and call it Apple Computer Company. Wayne takes a 10% stake in exchange for being, in his own words, the only adult in the room. 12 days later, terrified of personal liability if the company collapsed, he sells his stake back for $800. It would have been worth hundreds of billions. He says to this day, he doesn't regret it. The alternative, he's joked, was being the richest man in the cemetery. To actually fund the company, Jobs sold his Volkswagen van and Wozniak sold his HP 65 calculator. Combined, $1,300, not $5,000, $1,300, and the garage, Jobs' parents' garage in Los Altos, has become one of the most photographed buildings in tech history. Tourists still drive out to see it. But Wozniak himself has gone on record saying the garage barely mattered. No real engineering happened there. No prototyping. It was just a free place to sit because two broke 20-somethings had nowhere else to go. The garage didn't build Apple. The garage is just a better photo than a teenager's bedroom, which, according to Wozniak, is actually closer to the truth. What did matter was the product. Wozniak hand-built the Apple One, sold as a bare circuit board for $666.66. A price he picked simply because he liked repeating digits, not for any darker reason. About 200 units sold. Then came the Apple II in 1977, the machine that actually built the company. Color graphics, a real case, a keyboard. By 1980, when Apple went public, the company was valued at over $1 billion. Two broke kids and a calculator had become millionaires roughly 4 years after selling a van. That's the part of the story everyone knows. What almost nobody knows is what happened next, because Apple didn't have one near-death experience. It had several. By 1985, the company Steve Jobs co-founded didn't want him anymore. Jobs had recruited Pepsi executive John Sculley to run Apple, and within 2 years, the two men were in open warfare. The board sided with Sculley. Jobs was stripped of operational control and resigned that September. He didn't go quietly. He started a new company, Next, the same year, and walked away believing he'd build something that would humiliate the company that pushed him out. What followed at Apple was a decade that gets erased from the highlight reel. 3 different CEOs in 12 years, Sculley, then Michael Spindler, then Gil Amelio, none of whom could fix what was breaking underneath them. Apple's share of the personal computer market, once over 10%, collapsed to somewhere between 3 and 5%. The Newton, a handheld device years ahead of its time, launched half-finished and flopped. The product line ballooned into a confusing mess of overlapping computers that even Apple's own engineers struggled to explain to customers. By early 1996, the company posted a quarterly loss of $740 million. Apple's stock hit a 10-year low. And according to multiple accounts from that period, Apple's cash reserves had shrunk to the point where the company could only cover roughly 2 months of operations, the kind of number that, in any other industry, signals a company is about to disappear. Gil Amelio, brought in as a turnaround specialist, inherited that mess. He negotiated emergency credit extensions with Japanese lenders just to buy 6 more months of survival, then worked with Goldman Sachs on a financing package that injected over $600 million into a company nobody wanted to touch. It worked, barely. It got bad enough that Michael Dell, founder of rival Dell Computer, was asked in public what he'd do if he were running Apple. His answer: he'd shut the company down and return whatever cash was left to shareholders. That wasn't a hot take from an anonymous forum. That was the CEO of a direct competitor on record suggesting Apple's best move was to stop existing. The most valuable company in history was, 18 months before its comeback, one bad quarter away from a fire sale. Here's the part of the comeback story that usually gets flattened into Steve Jobs came back and saved the day. The truth is messier and more interesting. In late 1996, Amelio's team needed a modern operating system to replace Apple's aging, increasingly unworkable Mac OS. They looked at an outside company called B, but the asking price was too high and talk stalled. So Apple turned to another option. Next, the company Jobs had started after his ouster a decade earlier. In December 1996, Apple acquired Next for roughly $400 million, primarily to get its operating system technology, which would eventually become the foundation of Mac OS. The deal brought Jobs back into the building, officially just as an advisor. Unofficially, he started maneuvering almost immediately, lobbying board members and quietly undermining Amelio's authority. By July 1997, the board asked Amelio to step down. Jobs denied any involvement in the ouster. The board installed Jobs as interim CEO anyway. He inherited a company still bleeding cash, and his first call for help went to an unlikely source: Bill Gates, his longtime rival. Microsoft agreed to invest $150 million into Apple in non-voting stock, a lifeline from the company Apple had spent years publicly fighting. Then Jobs did something almost nobody talks about, because it isn't as cinematic as a product launch. He simplified. Apple's product line had ballooned into a confusing sprawl of overlapping computers. Jobs cut it down to a simple grid: desktop and laptop, consumer and professional, 4 products. That's it. It sounds boring. It's also one of the most consequential operational decisions in the company's history, because it stopped Apple from competing with itself. In 1998, the redesigned iMac launched, translucent, colorful, instantly recognizable, and Apple returned to profitability for the first time in years. The genius era of Steve Jobs had begun. But genius alone doesn't explain what happened over the next decade. The next part of the story is the part almost no documentary covers, and it's arguably the most important one. In 1998, a quiet, soft-spoken operations executive named Tim Cook left Compaq to join a company that was, by his own later admission, weeks away from collapse. Cook wasn't a product visionary. He wasn't on stage. He didn't design anything you've ever held in your hand. What he did was rebuild from the ground up the part of Apple that makes every single Jobs-era product possible at planetary scale: the supply chain. When Cook arrived, Apple was working with over 100 different suppliers and running a sprawling network of warehouses full of unsold inventory. The exact opposite of what a company on the edge of bankruptcy can afford. Cook cut the supplier list down to 24. He cut the number of warehouses roughly in half, and he obsessed, almost philosophically, over inventory itself. He's described it as fundamentally evil, comparing it to dairy products, something that spoils fast and that nobody wants once it's gone bad. Under his system, Apple's inventory turnover went from roughly a month's worth of stock sitting around down to under a week. He built deep manufacturing partnerships with contract manufacturers across Asia, Foxconn above all, instead of owning factories outright. That single relationship is the reason every iPhone, iPad, and Mac you've ever owned could physically exist in the quantities Apple needed, exactly when Apple needed them. This is the part nobody puts in the thumbnail, but it's the actual mechanism behind everything that followed. Steve Jobs could stand on a stage and unveil a beautiful product to a roaring crowd. But it was Tim Cook's operational machine, built years earlier and almost invisible to the public, that let Apple manufacture and ship tens of millions of those products globally without the wheels coming off. The iPod launch, the iPhone launch, the iPad launch. Every one of those overnight successes was sitting on top of a supply chain Cook had spent a decade quietly perfecting. Jobs got the keynote. Cook built the floor it was standing on. With the operational engine running and the product vision back in place, Apple's next decade reads like a highlight reel. The iPod in 2001, iTunes in 2003, the iPhone in 2007, the single product that would come to generate more revenue than entire economies, the App Store in 2008, turning the iPhone into a platform instead of just a device. By 2009, Jobs' health was failing, and Cook stepped in as interim CEO during his medical leave. Jobs officially resigned as CEO in August 2011 and died 2 months later. Cook took permanent control of a company most outsiders assumed couldn't survive without its founder. It didn't just survive. It detonated. Apple became the first publicly traded U.S. company to hit $1 trillion market cap in August 2018. $2 trillion came just over 2 years later, in August 2020. Then, on January 3, 2022, Apple became the first company in history, not just the first American company, the first company on Earth, to close above a $3 trillion valuation. Under Cook's roughly 15 years running the company, Apple added something on the order of $3.5 trillion in market value, from a company 2 months from bankruptcy to the most valuable corporation that had ever existed. And here's the part almost nobody puts in the title, because it complicates the victory lap. That crown didn't stay on Apple's head. As of 2026, Apple is no longer the most valuable company in the world. Nvidia, a chip company that spent decades as an afterthought next to Apple, became the first company ever to cross $4 trillion, then kept climbing past $5 trillion, driven by the global AI boom. Apple still sits in rarefied territory, hovering around $4 trillion, but it's now fighting Alphabet and Microsoft for second and third place, not sitting alone at the top. That's the real ending to this story, and it's a more honest one than Apple is the greatest company in history, full stop. The company that rose from $1,300 and a borrowed garage to the most valuable business on the planet has already been knocked off that exact perch. By an industry it didn't see coming, less than 2 years after taking the crown for itself. Empires don't fall all at once. Sometimes they just get quietly passed to whoever builds the next thing nobody saw coming. And if you want to understand a company that didn't see the next thing coming and paid for it in full, that's exactly where we're going next.